The first thing you notice at the old Lambert place isn't the ruin, it's the hush. Briars knot through the brick footings, pine needles curtaining the ash-white steps, and somewhere beyond the collapsed portico, a wind chime somebody hung decades after the fire ticks once, twice, as if remembering. If you stand long enough, the silence feels like a hand on your shoulder. This is Edgefield County, South Carolina. The winter of 1846 still seems to pool here in the shaded corners, as if time itself is reluctant to move on. In that winter, the Lambert plantation was a geometry of order laid over human suffering. From the road, visitors saw perfect rows of rice and cotton, a carriage drive trimmed with crepe myrtle, and a two-story Georgian house whose fanlight gleamed like a promise. The Lamberts' name opened doors from Charleston parlors to Savannah counting rooms. Respectability was their currency, reputation, their armor. But anyone who has ever lived in a great house knows that respectability is a mask. Behind it, the breath always fogs the glass. The plantation had been founded in 1798 by Donovan Lambert, an English immigrant with a talent for arithmetic and an absence where a conscience ought to be. He built his fortune by counting bodies as capital. More than 200 enslaved men, women, and children bent to his planting calendar, their lives measured in bales and bushels. The overseers understood his expectations. Word of his temper traveled farther than his wagons. He prided himself on being a practical man. He rarely raised his voice when money could do the shouting. By the time Donovan died in 1845, old, satisfied, and unpunished, the house had learned his rhythms. Doors eased closed when his boots sounded in the hall. Conversations lightened when he entered a room and darkened after he left it. The ledger kept on his escritoire recorded yields, purchases, births. The margins recorded nothing at all. That silence would prove the most expensive thing he owned. Inheritance placed the keys in his only legitimate child's hand. At 28, Craig Lambert returned from northern schools with tidy handwriting, a pocket full of improvements, and the confidence of a man who has never been refused. He read pamphlets about hygiene, admired modern drainage, and promised himself he would run the place more efficiently than his father, which he mistook for more humanely. Healthier workers meant stronger harvests, better rations reduced losses, fewer lashings saved time. He told himself these were enlightened measures. The enslaved people understood what they had always understood in the big house. Mercy arrived only when it paid. There was also Estella Donovan's widow, and Craig's mother, 58, and elegant. Her voice sounded smooth by years of conversation that said a great deal while revealing nothing at all. She wore her grief like a well-cut shawl, all angles tamed. Marriage to Donovan had taught her the art of endurance and the survival value of silence. In the months after the funeral, a certain brightness returned to her face, the kind that isn't joy so much as the absence of fear. She curated the house's routine with exacting gentility, placing teacups and secrets in the same cabinet. And then there was Lena. She moved through the main house like a note you couldn't stop hearing. 19, quick-eyed, steady-handed, trained in the refinements Estella prized. Linen turned so the seam never showed. Crystal carried so it never sang. She had arrived as a child, vanished, then returned. The house remembered the shape she made against the doorway. There was a composure about her that wasn't obedience, and a dignity that wasn't granted. Some people are born with the knowledge that they are more than what the world has decided to call them. This is dangerous knowledge on a plantation. Craig noticed her the way a lantern notices a mirror. He saw himself in the things he admired. At first it was practical. She was precise, discreet, always where the household needed her to be. But the practical is a short hallway to the perilous. He found reasons to keep her close, books to be returned, letters to be carried, inventories to be checked twice. Their conversations never announced themselves as anything more than their pretext. Sometimes the most damning words are the ones that never need saying. Edgefield society would not have flinched at a master's attention to a domestic girl. The ugliness of it had been normalized into furniture. Everyone knew such arrangements existed. No one admitted they were theft, disguised as romance. Estella, who saw farther than she ever confessed, watched Craig's manner soften when Lena entered a room and felt an old, unwelcome chill. She lengthened tasks that kept Lena in the laundry house and shortened the ones that drew her upstairs. She praised another girl's neat stitches. She told Craig, lightly, that appearances matter. In houses like this, the difference between a warning and a prayer is often only the tremor in a mother's hand. By autumn, the plantation had settled into the rut of Craig's reforms. He walked the dikes with the overseer, charted the drainage, penciled notes about rotating fields as if ink could cleanse soil. He imagined himself a modern man in an aging landscape. He also imagined quietly, insistently, that Lena understood him in ways others did not. He mistook the absence of refusal for consent, the hush of the house for approval, the stillness of a trapped thing for calm. It is important to say here what the house would not. There is no such thing as a love story between a master and the person he owns. There are only stories of power, yet power prefers the language of tenderness, because tenderness leaves fewer marks. So Craig couched things in talk of future improvements, as of freedom one day, as of recognition somehow. He spoke as if laws were problems that would yield to his effort. He had read enough books to trust in ingenuity, and not enough history to distrust himself. To everyone else, life went on. The pickers tallied sacks at dusk, backs stiff from the day-long bend. Children learned to step lightly past the overseer's shadow. In the quarters, women traded knowledge of roots and remedies, news and names, as if passing a flame from palm to palm. In the main house, the dining room glowed in the early dark, and the silver Estella's pride threw small faithful moons onto the ceiling. The table talk concerned weather, markets, a new family in Augusta, and, with practiced delicacy, nothing at all of consequence. But if you stood beneath the gallery after midnight, you might have heard a door click that was meant not to be heard, the soft tread of boots that believed themselves invisible, the whisper of a hand against a paneled wall, as if the house itself were trying to hold someone back. Secrets, like water, find their level. They swell in the places designed to contain them. They push at thresholds. Craig told himself he was different from his father. He wanted to believe that improved conditions, soap, fresh vegetables, a doctor summoned sooner, made him a better man. He used a new vocabulary for an old hunger. The plantation accepted this the way the river accepts a new reflection without comment, because the current underneath never changes. Estella began to sleep lightly. The way a person sleeps in a house she is certain has started talking. She listened for the noises that mean trouble, a laugh where no laughter should be, a quick intake of breath on the stair, the long pause that means two people are deciding whether to go forward or turn back. She said nothing to anyone but God, and even then she chose her words. As for Lena, she did what girls in peril learn to do early. She made herself small where smallness might be safety, and steady where steadiness might be mistaken for stone. But a life cannot be held so tightly that it doesn't bruise. There were moments, the flicker of a smile she tried to swallow, a question that found her eyes before she could lower them when the future tried to name itself. In Edgefield that year, everything important was happening in the spaces between what people allowed themselves to say. The county liked to tell itself a simple story about the Lamberts' good land, good breeding, good order. But houses are better historians than people. They keep the scratches on the banister where someone clutched hard, the heat stain on the desk where a lamp burned too long, the patch of floor that always remembers the sound of boots stopping there. If you had asked the Lambert house in 1846 what story it was keeping, it might have told you in the language of settling timbers and shifting light that the cost of what was coming had already been charged, only not yet paid. Before we go any farther, I'll ask you what I always ask when we open a door like this from where are you listening tonight, because places are part of stories, and your place will shape how you hear this one. If this is your first time here, subscribe so you do not miss the rest. What happened next would stain every ledger line Donovan balanced so neatly and teach Craig Lambert the oldest lesson. The South keeps trying not to learn that some truths, once taken into a house, cannot be kept from its rooms. The secret was already in motion. The winter had already set its hook, and somewhere beyond the trimmed hedges and the white columns, beneath the hush that made the chimney chimes tremble, The house was bracing itself for the sound of a child's first cry and everything that would follow. The first frosts of late 1845 glazed the rice fields in dull silver, the air heavy with the scent of dying reeds. Craig Lambert, now master of the estate, walked the dikes with a posture that looked confident from a distance, but carried the restless stiffness of someone rehearsing conviction. He kept his father's walking stick more for the sound it made striking the earth than for support, a way to remind the workers, and himself, that the name Lambert still commanded the land. He had inherited not just acreage, but an entire system of overseers trained to obey profit, a ledger written in bloodless arithmetic, and a household where fear had become so habitual it resembled discipline. Craig wanted to believe he could change things. He spoke of modern management, of treating laborers with a measure of dignity. His mother, Estella, watched him with a thin, careful smile. The smile women in her position mastered after years of understanding that ideals die quickly beneath the Carolina sun. Still, small differences appeared. Whippings became less frequent. Clothing and rations improved. Craig allowed the field hands to rest on Sundays, an act his father would have called sentimental weakness, but change in the South was a performance more than a practice. Craig's gestures of kindness did not alter what the place was built on. The people in the quarters measured him in quieter terms by the sharpness of the overseer's tone, by the days between punishments, by how long the master lingered in the big house after dusk. It was during one of those long evenings that Craig first truly saw Lena. She was arranging a table of silverware, the same silver Estella had inherited from her English mother, and her reflection shimmered between the polished spoons like a ghost trapped in metal. Something about her composure unsettled him. She neither shrank nor flaunted herself. Her movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic, and in them he sensed intelligence, the sort that is rarely permitted to speak. "Lena," he said one night, testing the name like a foreign word. "Yes." "Sire." Her voice was low, melodic, controlled. "You've been in this house long." "Since I was 8. "Sire." She didn't look up, didn't need to. Her eyes stayed on the linen she folded, but her answer was exact, neither submissive nor insolent, the tone of someone who has learned that precision is its own protection. After that, Craig found reasons to summon her questions about inventories, misplaced correspondence, the polishing of Donovan's study. Each meeting lasted a little longer. Sometimes they discussed small things, weather, music from Charleston, the strange quiet before a storm. He admired the clarity of her thoughts, and in that admiration was already possession. Estella noticed. She always noticed. From the landing above the main hall, she would watch her son's eyes follow the girl's movements. It was a gaze too constant to be casual. Estella had lived through this pattern before Donovan's wandering attentions, the silences that followed, the children who vanished from the house one by one. She told herself Craig was not his father, that education had softened him, yet she knew blood has a memory. One afternoon, Estella called Lena to her sitting room. The space smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. The curtains filtered the sun into narrow bands. "You've served us well." "Lena," she said, pouring tea neither of them would drink. "My son depends on order. He respects those who keep it." Lena inclined her head. "Yes, ma'am. There are expectations," Estella continued, her words chosen like glass beads, bright and brittle. "A household runs smoothly when everyone remembers their place." Lena met her gaze for the briefest moment, enough to acknowledge understanding, not enough to challenge it. "I remember, ma'am." That was the conversation's true subject, though no word of it was spoken. As winter settled, the evenings lengthened, the lamps in the main house burned later, and Craig's footsteps crossed the hall long after Estella had retired. He told himself his visits to the service wing were inspections, necessary for discipline, but discipline had nothing to do with the way his voice softened outside Lena's door, or how he lingered in the threshold, listening for her breathing in the dark. Power can disguise itself as concern. He began asking whether she was treated well by the other servants, whether she had enough to eat, whether she missed Charleston, the port city where she'd been purchased years before. She answered politely, warily, as women in her position had learned to do. Each question left a thread, invisible but tightening. For weeks, their exchanges remained words only. Then one evening, when rain blurred the windows and thunder hid the sound of movement, words became proximity. Lena would never later recall what she thought. In that instant, perhaps that refusal was impossible. Perhaps that she could survive this as she had survived everything else. Craig believed he was loved because he needed to believe it. The power to define the moment belonged entirely to him. Afterward, the silence between them changed. In the daytime, she resumed her duties. At night, he sought her out again, as if secrecy itself had become a ritual. In the quarters, whispers began to coil through the dark, the kind of rumors that move faster than wind, but die if spoken aloud near white ears. A girl in the kitchen claimed she saw the master leave the back corridor at dawn. A stable boy swore he heard a woman crying near the well. No one confronted anyone. On a plantation, knowledge is always traded like contraband, precious, dangerous, best hidden until it becomes survival. Estella's unease grew until it filled the house. She arranged for Craig to visit Charleston on business, hoping distance might cool his fascination. He left reluctantly and returned sooner than planned, citing unfinished affairs. The first thing he did upon arrival was summon Lena to the parlor to help unpack the crates. When Estella passed by, she heard them laughing softly. The sound chilled her. In Edgefield society, such matters were rarely named, but always known. Neighbors who prided themselves on decorum carried their own secrets behind shuttered windows. The difference was that the Lambert's facade had cracks wide enough for light or scandal to escape. Estella feared both. By January 1846, Craig's interest had become obsession. He began assigning Lena lighter duties to keep her near him. He even permitted her to read from his father's old Bible when she cleaned his office, a gesture meant to signal affection, but seen by others as arrogance. To love a slave was, in his world, a contradiction that could only exist in secrecy or ruin. He thought himself brave for crossing the line. In truth, he was only repeating the oldest cruelty in a new accent. Lena endured it in silence, torn between an instinct to survive and a flicker of feeling she could neither define nor trust. To some part of her heart, Craig was still the young master who spoke gently, who promised freedom one day. To every other part, he was her owner. She learned to smile carefully, to conceal dread behind composure. Meanwhile, the land itself seemed to sense what was coming. The crows gathered early on the bare pecans. The river swelled against the banks. The overseer complained of tools missing, of workers distracted. Estella prayed longer each night. The rhythm of the plantation faltered, just slightly, like a clock losing time. Then, one morning in May, Lena collapsed while serving breakfast. The silver tray clattered to the floor, the sound sharp enough to slice through conversation. Craig rushed forward, catching her before she hit the ground. Estella's eyes met Mammy Eliza's across the room, and in that silent exchange, two women of different worlds understood the same terrible thing. Outside, thunder rolled across the fields, though the sky was clear. The season was changing. Something inside the Lambert house had already begun to rot. The morning Lena fainted, the house changed its breath. From that moment on, the Lambert plantation stopped being merely wealthy and started being watched not by its neighbors, but by its own walls. Estella ordered that Lena rest in the small sewing room beside the east corridor, where the air was cooler. Mammy Eliza tended to her quietly, and within hours the truth became impossible to hide. Lena was with child. Craig's reaction was an impossible mixture of pride and fear. He told himself the pregnancy was fate, a sign that his love for Lena had been sanctified. But when he looked into his mother's eyes, he found no blessing there, only the grim recognition of what such a child would mean in South Carolina. Iten Babai Sushulio. Estella spoke first. "You will keep this to yourself," she said, "for her sake, and for yours." Craig tried to protest, but she raised her hand. "You think the world will allow this child to exist. The law will not, nor will society, and if anyone discovers it, Lena will pay the price. Not you. He turned away, unable to meet her gaze. Somewhere inside him, he knew she was right. In that time and place, the law drew its lines with cold precision. A child born of a slave mother inherited her condition, regardless of the father's identity, even if Craig had been willing to claim the baby. That claim would mean nothing. The law saw no love here, only property. Yet in the weeks that followed, Craig clung to his illusions. He wrote to an old acquaintance in Charleston, "I love you," asking about manumission through paternal recognition. The answer came swiftly. Impossible in this state. He wrote again, this time to a northern contact, asking about relocation. There was no reply. Still, Craig continued his fantasy. He began sketching plans for a small house on the edge of the property, a cottage for the overseer's family. He said publicly, though the overseer already had a home, to the men who worked for him, it was merely another of the young master's eccentric ideas. To Estella, it was madness dressed as hope. Lena's belly began to swell by midsummer. She moved more slowly now, her steps measured, her silence deeper. Only Eliza and Estella knew the truth. The rest of the household whispered behind closed doors, their guesses circling closer with every passing week. Elisa, whose wisdom had been forged through decades of loss, watched the girl's body change and felt the weight of a secret far heavier than the pregnancy itself. Each time she placed a hand on Lena's abdomen, she remembered another night, 19 years before, when she had done the same for a woman named Sarah. Sarah had been young, barely 20, sold to the Lambert plantation from Charleston in 1826. Donovan had taken an interest in her almost immediately. Within months, she carried his child. Eliza was there the night Sarah died in childbirth, the same night Lena was born. Donovan had looked upon the newborn with something close to fascination, remarking on her fair skin and grey eyes, the unmistakable mark of his own blood. Then, as quickly as he'd shown interest, he ordered Eliza to keep silent and the child to be raised among the house servants. For 8 years, Eliza had cared for the girl as best she could. She had taught her to read the weather, to recognize danger in silence, to hide intelligence behind humility. And then, one day, Donovan ordered Lena Salt. The man who came from Charleston to take her didn't ask questions. Money smothers curiosity. Eliza never saw the girl again, not until the day she returned. Grown, purchased back by the same man who had once banished her, Donovan had arranged her reappearance through a trader, claiming she was a skilled domestic worth reacquiring. Eliza had never understood why until now. That summer of 1846, while the fields shimmered with heat, she began to pray each night for courage, courage to tell the truth, and courage to keep it, because she knew that the father of Lena's unborn child was also her half-brother. Craig, meanwhile, lived in a fever of anticipation. He ordered special linens for Lena's confinement, books about infant care, and even had the carpenter build a small cradle, though he kept it hidden in a locked storage room. To Estella, these acts were signs of obsession, not love. Her son had become consumed by a vision no reality could sustain. She tried to reason with him. You cannot free her, Craig. Even if you did, the world would still see her as she was born. And what of the child? You would condemn it before it takes a breath. I will change the laws, he said, his voice trembling with conviction that sounded too much like desperation. I will take them north. And what of me? She asked quietly. Shall I die here alone, while you chase your ruin? Her words cut deeper than she intended. Craig left the room without answering. The plantation itself began to mirror the tension of the household. Field hands spoke in lowered tones. Work slowed, and the overseer complained of distractions. He noticed Craig's absence from the fields, his long hours in the main house, his sleepless walks at dawn. To the workers, these were omens. The old master's ghost, they said, had returned to punish the son for his defiance. By August, Lena's condition could no longer be concealed. Estella fabricated a story that Lena had taken ill with nervous exhaustion and required rest under supervision. The other servants accepted this outwardly, but whispers are patient. They wait for truth to ripen. In private, Eliza did all she could to ease Lena's fear. She brewed teas of raspberry leaf and mugwort, the remedies of generations of women who had learned to heal without physicians. Yet no amount of herbs could quiet the terror that lived in Lena's eyes. She began to dream of children born without faces, of rivers running red with clay. She spoke of hearing her mother's voice calling from the corners of the room. Craig mistook her fear for frailty. He would sit beside her, reading aloud from his father's Bible passages about redemption and renewal, words he believed could bless what he had cursed. He did not understand that for Lena, each verse sounded like a warning. As the first leaves began to brown in late August, Lena's body grew heavier, her movements slower. Estella rarely entered the room now. She could not bear to look at the girl whose swelling belly made mockery of the Lambert name. Craig stayed close, sleeping fitfully on the settee outside her door, as though guarding the threshold could protect them from what was coming. Then, in the first week of September, the contractions began. Eliza knew immediately that the timing was wrong, too soon, too violent. The birth would not wait for safety or secrecy. Craig sent a messenger for a doctor from Charleston, but Estella stopped him halfway down the drive. "No one beyond this house must know," she said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. "We will handle it here." So the house sealed itself in silence. Candles burned through the night as thunder rolled over the rice field. In the upstairs chamber, Lena screamed until her voice broke, while Eliza worked by lamplight, whispering prayers she hadn't said since Sarah's death. Estella stood beside her, holding the girl's hand and watching the blood soak the sheets. Craig paced outside the door, muttering fragments of psalms, each plea swallowed by the storm. The hours dragged into dawn. When the baby finally arrived, the cries that filled the room were not a newborn's. They were the sounds of horror. The child was alive, but barely. Its limbs were twisted, its face marked by deformities too severe to describe. Estella gasped, covering her mouth. Eliza froze, understanding instantly what this meant. The curse of shed blood made flesh. Craig burst in before anyone could stop him. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, voice shaking, he whispered, "My son." No one corrected him. The child lived for only a few hours. Craig cradled it as if love could steady its failing breath. Lena wept until her body went limp, whispering that she wanted to follow. When the infant finally died, Craig refused to let it be taken away. He wrapped it himself, ordered a coffin of oak, and buried it in the slave cemetery under the same tree where Donovan had once punished his workers. Estella begged him to let the midwife perform the rites, but Craig insisted. "He is my blood," he said, his eyes hollow. "He will not be buried as property." At dawn, as mist rose over the fields, Craig read from the book of Job. The verses echoed through the fog the Lord gave, "And the Lord hath taken away." Behind him, Lena watched, her body wrapped in a blanket, her face pale as the sky. She said nothing. She only stared at the small mound of earth, as if waiting for it to breathe again. And in that silence, Mammy Eliza felt the full weight of the truth she had hidden for nearly 2 decades, a truth that, if spoken, would destroy them all. The days after the burial moved like ghosts through the house, silent, unsteady, refusing to leave. Craig spent the mornings kneeling at the tiny grave beneath the willow, whispering fragments of prayers that no one was meant to hear. By afternoon, he sat in his father's study, filling page after page with cramped handwriting his thoughts, his guilt, his attempts to make sense of what had happened. He wrote to doctors in Charleston and Savannah, describing in exact detail the child's deformities. He spoke of unnatural development, of divine punishment, of hereditary mystery. The letters were sent with trembling hands and returned without answers. Medicine in 1846 could not explain what faith already feared. Lena did not speak for days. Her eyes were open but saw nothing. Sometimes she would touch her stomach and whisper that she could still feel movement. Estella sat beside her in silence, unsure whether to comfort or condemn. Every attempt at conversation ended in tears. At night, Craig would sit outside her door, unable to sleep, listening to her faint weeping until dawn. He told himself he was atoning, but it sounded more like penance. Only one person in the household understood the terrible geometry that connected all of this, Mammy Eliza. She had carried the truth for nearly 20 years, and now it had come to collect its debt. The child's twisted limbs, the misshapen skull, she had seen such marks before, and always in children born of too close blood. Eliza moved about the house in quiet dread. She prayed as she worked, murmuring words from an old language that the others did not recognize. Each time she saw Craig and Lena together, guilt coiled tighter around her chest. She could feel the house waiting, as if it knew that one more secret lay behind the walls. It had all begun. She remembered, with Sarah, a name no one spoke anymore. Sarah had arrived from Charleston in the spring of 1826, barely 20, a slave with a face that made even the mistress look twice. Donovan Lambert noticed her the first day she stepped from the wagon. Within months, the girl had been moved from the quarters to the main house. For domestic service, everyone knew what that meant. Eliza was forced to look after her, to wash her bruises, to prepare her food, to pretend not to hear her crying when the master's footsteps echoed down the hall. When Sarah's belly began to swell, Donovan's temper worsened. He forbade anyone from mentioning it. And when the child came a pale-skinned baby girl with grey eyes, he ordered Eliza to keep the birth quiet. Sarah died within the hour, bleeding out before Eliza's helpless hands. Donovan looked at the infant for a long time, silent, calculating. "She will be raised in the house," he said finally, "but she is never to be called mine." And so Lena grew up beneath Estella's roof, fed and dressed among the house servants, her mother's name erased from every record. 8 years later, when whispers began to circulate about her resemblance to the master, Donovan had her sold to a Charleston trader. Eliza had begged him not to. "She's just a child," she pleaded. But Donovan only said, "Children are easiest to forget when they're gone." That night, Eliza watched the wagon disappear down the road with the girl sitting quietly in the back, clutching a rag doll. She prayed she would never see her again for the child's sake. But sin, like blood, finds its way home. In 1845, just months before his death, Donovan had purchased Lena back. He never explained why. The trader said the order came through an intermediary, the paperwork signed in another man's name. Eliza suspected he had felt the creeping weight of his own conscience, or perhaps it was just another form of ownership, reclaiming what he considered his property. When Lena stepped off the wagon once more, Eliza had nearly fallen to her knees. The child she had nursed was now a woman, unaware of the lineage written in her face. Donovan greeted her with detached politeness, as if she were any other servant. Only Eliza understood what it meant. Now, in the aftermath of the baby's death, that knowledge pressed against her chest like a stone. She knew she should tell someone, Craig, or perhaps Estella, yet the thought of saying the words aloud terrified her. The truth would not cleanse, it would burn everything it touched. One evening, as she sat by the kitchen hearth, she heard footsteps and looked up to see Craig standing there, his shirt open at the throat, his eyes hollow from sleeplessness. "Elisa," he said softly, "you've known this family longer than anyone. Tell me, why did God do this to us?" The question struck her like a blow. For a moment, she considered lying, but the truth was already clawing at her throat. "Some things," she said carefully, "ain't the Lord's doing at all. Some things come from men and the sins they plant before we're born." Craig frowned, not understanding. "You speak in riddles." Eliza looked down at her hands. "Then maybe that's best." He left without another word, but Eliza knew it was only a matter of time before the truth forced its way out. Lena's health worsened as September turned to October. Her fever rose at night, her dreams filled with the cries of the child she had lost. She began to talk to shadows, calling them by names. Eliza recognized Sarah, and sometimes Mother. Each time, Eliza felt her own strength falter. Estella, too, had changed. She spent hours staring out the window toward the cemetery, her face pale and unreadable. The scandal she feared had not yet escaped the house. But secrets have a way of rotting even behind closed doors. One night, unable to bear it any longer, Eliza went to her room. Estella was seated at her vanity, brushing her hair in slow, automatic strokes. "Miss Estella," Elisa began, voice trembling. "There's something you got to hear. About Lena, about where she come from." Estella lowered the brush. "What are you talking about?" Elisa hesitated. Once the words left her mouth, they could never be unsaid, but silence had already killed one child. Perhaps it would kill another if she continued to keep it. She told her everything about Sarah, about Donovan, about the sale and the return. When she finished, the room was silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Estella's face had gone as white as porcelain. "You're saying," her voice broke, "you're saying that girl is his?" Eliza nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Donovan's blood runs in her veins, same as Mr. Craig's." Estella covered her mouth, trembling. "Dear God." The brush slipped from her hand and struck the floor. Eliza waited for her to speak again, but she didn't. She simply sat, staring at her reflection, as if trying to find in her own face some sign of the curse that had destroyed her family. After a long silence, Estella whispered, "No one can ever know. Do you understand me? Not a soul." Eliza nodded, but inside, she knew the truth had already begun to move like fire under the floorboards, invisible until it was too late. Outside, the wind rose, carrying the smell of damp earth from the cemetery. Somewhere in the darkness, a whippoorwill called a sound the slave said meant death was near, and in the room upstairs, Lena stirred from uneasy sleep, whispering a single word through cracked lips: "Mother." October came heavy and airless, the kind of month when even the cicadas seemed too weary to cry. The Lambert plantation, once a marvel of discipline and profit, now breathed unevenly, as though the land itself sensed the sickness growing within its house. Lena's confinement had left a pall over everything. Meals went half-eaten, conversations collapsed into silence. Estella walked like a ghost between rooms, her thoughts trapped in the horror that Mammy Eliza had revealed the revelation that had turned love into sin and lineage into curse. Each night she debated whether to tell Craig. Each morning she told herself she could not. The truth would kill him faster than any fever. But secrets, like infections, rarely remain contained. Craig himself was disintegrating. Sleep fled from him, and when he did doze, nightmares came, the baby's deformed face turning toward him in the dark, the echo of its shallow breathing crawling through his dreams. By dawn, he would stumble to the small grave beneath the willow, kneel, and whisper broken prayers that had no beginning and no end. "I will make this right," he would mutter, again and again, as if repetition could bend the universe into forgiveness. He began writing in a small leather-bound book, recording every detail of the birth, every theory that might explain what had happened. His handwriting grew increasingly desperate, the ink pressing deep into the paper, as if he were trying to carve sense into it. He wrote to physicians in Charleston, Savannah, even New Orleans, describing the deformities in clinical precision. None replied with certainty. Their answers came cloaked in superstition or speculation: bad blood, divine judgment, the wages of sin. Craig rejected the last with fury. "It is science," he insisted to Estella. "Something in the soil, the water. I will find the reason." Estella said nothing. Her silence was the only kindness she could still offer. Lena drifted between fever and despair. Sometimes she spoke clearly. Sometimes her words made no sense. "He was beautiful," she whispered once to Eliza, "before I saw his face." Other nights, she cried that the baby was calling to her from the grave. Eliza stayed at her bedside, trying to soothe her with hymns and herbs. But every time Lena closed her eyes, she seemed to fall deeper into that world of punishment and loss. One afternoon, Estella found Eliza alone in the kitchen, her hands shaking as she kneaded bread. "You did right to tell me," Estella said quietly. Eliza didn't look up. "Did I sometimes truth don't save? Miss Estella, sometimes it just burns." Estella wanted to argue, but couldn't. She stared at the old woman's hands, strong, scarred, trembling, and thought of how many births, deaths, and secrets they had held. That night, a storm swept in from the coast. The air smelled of salt and decay, and lightning carved brief, violent shapes across the horizon. Craig stood at his study window, staring at the fields, at the thin silhouettes of slaves running for cover. He remembered his father's voice, calm, cruel, proud, saying that a man's property was an extension of his will. Craig had once despised that logic. Now, in some twisted way, he understood it. Power infected everyone it touched. He went to the parlor and poured brandy until the glass overflowed. In the glow of the fire, he imagined the child's face again, its gray, unfocused eyes, its breath like a dying candle. "What was I?" he whispered. "Father, murderer, or fool?" No one answered, only the thunder. By morning, the storm had passed, but the damage remained. The willow over the grave had split down the center, lightning blackening its trunk. Craig took it as a sign, though he could not decide of what. He began visiting the grave even more often, leaving offerings, small toys, bits of ribbon, or pages torn from his journal. He told himself he was honoring the child. Others whispered that he was losing his mind. The enslaved workers avoided the cemetery now. They said they saw lights moving there after dark, heard a man talking to the earth as though it might answer. The young masters touched. They murmured, "The dead don't rest easy when blood's mixed wrong." Inside the main house, Estella's health began to fail. She ate little, slept less, and seemed to shrink under the weight of what she knew. She no longer wore jewelry. Her once perfect hair went unpinned. To the outside world, she remained the impeccable widow, but behind closed doors her hands shook so badly she could barely hold a teacup. It was Eliza who finally forced her to face the decision she'd been avoiding. "He's breaking," Eliza said one night. "You can see it same as I do. If you don't tell him, the truth will find its own way out, and when it does, it won't be kind." Estella looked at her with hollow eyes. "And if I do tell him, it will destroy what's left." "Maybe it already has," Eliza whispered. For 3 nights, Estella prayed for guidance, for forgiveness, for strength to do what no mother should have to do. On the 4th morning, she found Craig in the study, surrounded by his notes. He was muttering aloud, tracing the family tree with shaking fingers. "Something hereditary," he said, pointing to a page. "There must have been illness in father's bloodline. Perhaps the English cousins, malformed infants, were not uncommon." His mother stood in the doorway, her lips bloodless. "Stop, Craig," she said softly. He turned, startled. "You know something." She hesitated, her breath shallow. Then, in a voice stripped of everything but duty, she said the words that would end what remained of their family. "Lena is your father's child." The room fell silent. The sound of the mantel clock became unbearable. Craig blinked, uncomprehending, then laughed, a sharp, broken sound that frightened her. "That's impossible," he said. "I wish it were." He shook his head, backing away as if distance could undo the sentence. "No, you're mistaken. She was bought from Charleston." "By your father," Estella interrupted. "He sold her when she was 8 and bought her back. She carries his blood." "Craig, the same blood as yours." He froze, his face drained of color. The papers slipped from his hands and scattered across the floor. For a long time he said nothing. Then, slowly, his body began to tremble. "God," he whispered. "God help me." But there was no help left. Craig stumbled toward the door, knocking over the lamp. The flame caught the edge of one of his papers before Eliza rushed in to stamp it out. By the time the room was dark again, he was gone out into the yard, into the fields. into the storm of his own making. Estella sank to her knees, her sobs muffled by the rug. She had saved her son from ignorance, but not from ruin. That night, Craig did not return to the main house. He slept by the grave instead, his body curled against the earth as though trying to sink into it. The next morning, the servants found him still there, his clothes soaked with dew, his face grey and hollow. When Estella saw him, she understood whatever part of her son had once been whole had died in the telling prawn. From that day forward, Craig spoke little. He moved through the house like a man half buried. He avoided Lena, avoided mirrors, avoided light, and in the silence that settled over them, the house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next tragedy it knew must come. The Lambert house grew quieter than any church. Achstip, each whispered conversation, echoed as though the walls themselves were listening for confession. Since the morning Estella revealed the truth, Craig had not spoken more than a handful of words. The man who once strode through the halls with purpose now drifted like smoke, silent, half-seen, directionless. He avoided Lena entirely. If they crossed paths by accident, he turned away so violently it made her flinch. To her, it was rejection. To him, it was self-preservation. Every glance at her face was like looking into a mirror smeared with guilt. The same grey eyes, the same delicate line of the jaw features that had once stirred desire, now mocked him with their resemblance to his father's. Estella watched it all unfold with the numbness of someone already mourning. She had believed that truth, however terrible, was preferable to deceit. But truth had not freed her son. It had consumed him. He slept little, ate less, and began muttering prayers under his breath, verses about sin, blood, and redemption. He spent hours in the library, copying lines from Leviticus and Ecclesiastes, as if repetition could rewrite his past. Lena noticed the change and mistook it for grief. She had no idea what her lover-turned stranger now knew. To her, Craig's distance was punishment for the baby's death. She told herself that if she prayed enough, repented enough, he would forgive her. Eliza watched the girl's efforts with pity. "Child," she whispered one night, "you don't even know what you're asking forgiveness for." Craig's journals became darker by the day. He wrote of divine balance, of needing to purify the household. In one entry he scrawled, "There is rot in the bloodline. It must end with me." He spent hours wandering the fields, sometimes barefoot, murmuring to the wind. The slaves who saw him began to avoid his path, crossing themselves when he passed. Word spread through the quarters that the young master had lost his soul in the cemetery. By late October, the harvest season had begun to fail. Without Craig's supervision, the fields went untended, the overseers confused by his erratic orders. Some days he demanded double work. Others he forbade anyone from leaving the quarters, insisting the land needed rest. Profits fell. The once efficient plantation had become a place adrift. Estella tried to hold the household together through sheer force of habit, the same tea at 4, the same music on Sundays, as if routine could resurrect reason. But even her composure was cracking. She often stopped mid-sentence, staring into space, her lips forming words no one could hear. Lena remained confined indoors. Her body was frail from months of weakness, her mind fractured between faith and despair. She prayed constantly, kneeling until her knees bruised. "Forgive me," she whispered, "for whatever sin I carry." Sometimes she thought she saw the baby's reflection in mirrors or windows, small and shapeless, calling her name. Eliza begged Estella to send the girl away to Charleston, anywhere far from Craig. But Estella shook her head. "If I send her off, tongues will wag. If I keep her here, the secret dies with us." Neither woman realized that the secret was already alive in another form, festering inside Craig's mind, feeding on his guilt. One night, Estella found him in Donovan's old study. The fireplace was unlit, but the smell of smoke hung in the air. He was sitting at the desk, the pistol his father once owned resting beside an open Bible. "Craig," she said softly, stepping closer, "you must eat." He didn't look up. Did he ever tell you? Who? Father. About the others. She froze. What others? He turned his gaze toward her, and for a moment she saw the madness behind his eyes, a feverish gleam that both terrified and broke her heart. There were more, weren't there, before Lena? I've read the ledgers. The names scratched out. The girls sold away. He left a trail of ghosts. Estella's lips parted, but no sound came. He had gone through the plantation records, Donovan's hidden ledgers, where the names of young female slaves vanished in sudden, unexplained sales. The proof had been there all along. Craig gave a bitter laugh. So this is the inheritance. Mother. Not the land. Not the money. Sin. That's what runs in our blood. He stood, gripping the pistol. Estella's heart seized. Craig, please. He placed the weapon back down gently. Don't worry. Not yet. Then, softer, I need to speak with her first. Estella's knees went weak. No. Craig, you mustn't. But he was already walking toward the door. She deserves to know what she is. Please, Estella whispered. You'll destroy her. He paused at the threshold, looking back over his shoulder. Mother, there's nothing left to destroy. When he left, Estella collapsed into the chair, shaking. Eliza found her minutes later, her face pale as chalk. He's going to tell her, Estella whispered. He's going to tell Lena. Eliza gripped her shoulders. We have to stop him. Lord, that girl's heart won't survive it. But by the time they reached the corridor, Craig was already climbing the stairs. Upstairs, Lena sat sewing small garments by candlelight, clothes meant for a baby that would never wear them. The flicker of the flame caught the tears on her cheeks. She didn't hear him enter. Lena, Craig said softly. She turned, startled. Mr. Craig, you shouldn't be here. He stepped closer, his face drawn and pale. You're trembling. I'm fine, she lied. Just tired. He looked at the half-finished infant clothes on her lap. Why do you keep making those? I don't know, she said, forcing a smile. It feels like he's still here. Maybe if I keep sewing, he'll come back. Craig's throat tightened. No, he won't. The silence that followed was unbearable. Lena tried to fill it. I know you hate me now, she said softly. For what happened? For losing him. I don't hate you, Craig said. I hate what we are. She frowned, confused. What we are? He hesitated. His mother's words echoed in his mind. Don't tell her. But guilt is a cruel confessor. It demands an audience. Lena, he whispered. I know who your father was. She blinked, unsure what he meant. Donovan Lambert. He said, my father, your father. The words fell like stones. At first, she laughed a small, disbelieving sound. No, that can't be true. He stepped closer, his eyes wet. Elisa knew. She was there when you were born. He sold you to hide the shame. You came back here because he bought you again. Don't you see we share the same blood? Lena's face went white. She shook her head violently, backing away until she hit the wall. You're lying. You've gone mad. I wish I were, he said, but it's true. She pressed her hands to her temples, trembling. No, no, God wouldn't allow it. God allowed far worse in this house, he said bitterly. He allowed me to love you. Her scream shattered the silence. She covered her ears, crying out words that were more prayer than language. Craig tried to reach her, but she struck his hand away, sobbing, Don't touch me, don't ever touch me. Her cries carried down the stairs, echoing through the house. Estella and Eliza rushed upward, hearts pounding. By the time they reached the door, Lena was on the floor, rocking, her eyes unfocused. Craig stood over her, shaking, whispering apologies that dissolved into tears. Estella pushed past him and gathered Lena in her arms. What did you do? She demanded. Craig stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. I told her the truth. Eliza closed her eyes, Lord, help us all, she murmured. For the rest of the night, Lena neither spoke nor slept. She sat by the window, murmuring to herself, one hand pressed against her stomach, as if guarding something invisible. Downstairs, Craig sat alone with the pistol again, the barrel resting against the table. He stared at it for a long time but didn't move. Truth, he whispered, is the cruelest mercy of all. The candle burned down beside him, the wax pooling like melted bone. Outside, the willow swayed in the wind, its split trunk creaking like a house trying to confess. And somewhere in the dark, the story that had begun with Donovan Lambert's sins was reaching for its last act. November 1846 arrived, not with cold but with a suffocating stillness. The Lambert house felt like it had forgotten how to breathe. The servants spoke in whispers. Doors that once stayed open were now shut tight, as if to keep the air itself from escaping. Lena had not left her room since the night Craig revealed the truth. She sat by the window for hours, her eyes vacant, her fingers tracing the glass as if trying to feel the world beyond it. Sometimes she would hum a lullaby with no melody. Other times she would whisper prayers under her breath, fragments of confession torn between despair and disbelief. Estella and Mammy Eliza took turns watching over her, but neither could reach her. Lena refused food, refused comfort, refused life. Her body grew thin, and her once bright voice now came only in murmurs about sin and purification. Craig avoided her completely. Each morning he rose before dawn, visited the child's grave beneath the split willow, and stayed there until the sun climbed high. When he returned, his clothes were damp with dew and his hands streaked with dirt. He told no one what he did there, only that he was praying for redemption. In truth, Craig no longer prayed, he bargained. He begged the earth to take him instead, to undo what had been done. When no voice answered, he began reading scripture as if searching for permission to end his suffering. He fixated on passages about sacrifice, sin, and cleansing by fire. The other slaves spoke of him as a haunted man. They said his eyes had gone hollow and that he wandered the fields at night, calling his father's name. Some claimed to have seen him kneeling at the graves, speaking to things that were not there. Inside the house, Estella tried to hold what little order remained. She forced herself to dress each morning, to host dinners no one attended, to pretend that their name still held meaning, but she was living in a mausoleum, one she had built with her own truth. Then, one morning, Eliza came to her with trembling hands. "Miss Estella," she said quietly, the girls expecting again. "Estella Frozze. You're certain?" Eliza nodded. "She told me herself. Says it happened before she knew the truth. Lord help us. She's terrified. Says she don't want to bring another cursed child into this world." Estella's knees buckled. For a long moment, she could not speak. When she finally did, her voice was a whisper. Craig must not know. But secrets in the Lambert house had a way of finding ears. That afternoon, Craig found Lena sitting in the nursery, sewing another small garment. The light slanted through the window, catching the fine tremor in her hands. "What are you doing?" he asked. She didn't turn. "Preparing." "For what?" "For what's coming," she said softly. He stepped closer, his voice sharp. "What's coming?" Her hand stilled over the fabric. "A child." Craig froze, his face drained of color. "No." She nodded weakly. "It's God's punishment. I can feel it." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Craig's composure cracked. "No more," he said. "We can't. Not again." Tears welled in Lena's eyes. "You think I want this? I didn't ask for it." "Craig, I didn't ask for any of it." He turned away, running his hands through his hair, trembling. "We're cursed. Lena, our blood, it's poison. You can't carry that again. I can't watch another child die." Her voice broke. "Then what do I do?" Craig stared at her with an expression that frightened her more than anger. Ever could the hollow stare of a man whose faith had turned to ash. "Pray," he whispered, Pray that God forgives us." He left the room without another word. That night, Lena went to Eliza's quarters, her steps uncertain but determined. The old woman rose from her cot, startled to see her there. "Child," she said softly, "you shouldn't be out of bed." Lena's face was pale, her eyes burning with quiet desperation. "I need your help." Eliza frowned. "What kind of help?" "The kind you've given others. The kind that stops what's inside me before it's too late." The words hung between them. Eliza's stomach turned cold. "You don't know what you're asking. Those herbs, they can kill you." "I don't care," Lena said. "I'd rather die clean than bring another monster into this world." Eliza shook her head, tears rising. "It ain't a monster, child. It's just a baby." "It's a curse," Lena whispered. "I can feel it growing like rot inside me." Eliza hesitated, torn between mercy and horror. She had brewed those remedies before for girls who refused to bear their master's children, but never for someone she loved like her own blood. Finally, she gave a slow, trembling nod. "If I do this, you must understand. Once you drink it, there's no turning back." Lena met her eyes. "There's no going back anyway." The next day, Eliza gathered the herbs pennyroyal, savin, and crushed roots she'd kept hidden behind the smokehouse. She brewed them into a dark, bitter tea that smelled of iron and sorrow. Lena drank it without flinching. The pain began within an hour. She doubled over on the floor, sweat pouring from her brow, her cries muffled in her hands. Eliza held her as the spasms racked her body, whispering prayers that trembled on her lips. By nightfall, the sheets were soaked in blood. Lena collapsed, her breath shallow, her eyes glazed. "It's done," she whispered. "It's gone." Craig found them an hour later. He had heard the sounds, the low moans, the rustle of feet, and burst into the room to see Lena half-conscious, her dress stained crimson. Eliza knelt beside her, her hands slick with blood. "What have you done?" Craig roared. Lena's eyes fluttered open. "I fixed it," she murmured. "I killed the sin before it killed us." Craig's face twisted. "You murdered our child." "It wasn't a child," she said weakly. "It was a punishment." He staggered back, his breath ragged. "You had no right." "No right," she cried, her voice breaking. "You think I asked for this life, for your father's blood and yours inside me? I'm the one who pays for your sins." Her words struck him harder than any blow. For a moment, he said nothing. Then something inside him broke. He turned and stormed from the room, his footsteps pounding down the hall like thunder. Eliza clutched the girl to her chest, rocking her gently, murmuring through tears, "Hush now, baby, hush." But Lena wasn't crying anymore. She was staring at the ceiling, whispering, "I'm clean now. God will take me." Eliza wept harder. She knew the cost of cleansing in this house had always been blood. Downstairs, Craig paced the study, gripping the pistol again. The moonlight struck his face through the tall window, carving him into something unrecognizable. His whispers were fevered, almost ecstatic. "Forgiveness," he muttered. "It has to end with me." Outside, the storm clouds began to gather over Edgefield once more, slow, black, and inevitable. The next tragedy was already walking toward the house. The night of November 27, Etienne Barbe Suchalou, began with the kind of wind that carries omens. The air pressed against the house, thick and electric, rattling the shutters as if demanding entry. Inside, candles flickered, their flames bending low. Uneasy, every soul on the Lambert plantation felt that something was about to break. Upstairs, Lena lay pale and motionless. She hadn't moved since the bleeding stopped. Mammy Eliza sat beside her, wringing a damp cloth between her hands, whispering prayers she had whispered too many times before. "Lord, don't take her yet," she said under her breath. "She's suffered enough." Downstairs, Craig moved through the house like a shadow that had lost its body. His boots left mud on the floors. His shirt was half-buttoned, his face hollow. He stopped in front of Donovan's portrait in the hall, the old master's eyes gleaming faintly in the candlelight. "You did this," Craig hissed. "You began this curse, and now it ends with me." He tore the portrait from the wall. It fell with a crash that shook dust from the beams. Estella, startled by the sound, rushed from her room. "Craig, what are you doing?" He turned toward her slowly, his expression calm but empty, as if someone else were speaking through him. "It ends tonight," he said simply, and walked past her toward the stairs. Estella felt the old terror return, the same dread she'd lived with under Donovan's rule. The knowledge that violence had its own rhythm in this house. She followed him up, her heart pounding. Eliza looked up when the door opened. She saw Craig's face and rose immediately, her body instinctively shielding Lena. "You got no business here tonight," she said firmly. Craig's voice was low, almost gentle. "Leave us." "Elisa." The old woman shook her head. "No, sire. Not when your eyes look like that." "Elisa," Estella said softly behind him. "Please." Eliza glanced between them, the broken son, the desperate mother of the half-dead girl, and realized she could not stop what was coming. "Lord, forgive me," she whispered. Then she stepped aside and left the room, closing the door behind her. For a long moment, Craig and Lena said nothing. Only the wind filled the silence, whistling through the cracks in the window. Lena stirred weakly. "Why are you here?" she asked. Her voice was barely a breath. Craig knelt beside the bed. "To ask why," he said. Her eyes fluttered open, dull and distant. "You already know why." "I needed that child," he whispered. "It was supposed to be our redemption, a chance to make something pure from all this filth." She turned her head toward him, a ghost of a smile on her lips. "There is no redemption in our blood, Craig, only consequence." He reached for her hand, but she pulled it away. "You murdered him," he said. "I freed him," she replied, "and I freed us." Her words ignited something in him: rage, grief, self-loathing, all fused into one unbearable flame. "Freed us," he repeated. "You've damned us." He rose abruptly, knocking over the chair. The candlelight flared and dimmed. Lena struggled to sit up, trembling. "You can't hurt me worse than the truth already has," she said, her defiance soft. Exhausted, but steady, undid the last thread of reason in him. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he said, voice breaking. "You killed the only thing that could have saved us." She stared at him, tears in her eyes. "Then maybe we were never meant to be saved." Something inside Craig snapped. He moved toward her, shouting now incoherent words about sin and purification. The house below seemed to listen, the walls holding their breath. Estella, standing at the bottom of the stairs, heard the shouting and froze. She turned to Eliza, who was already climbing back up. "He'll hurt her," Estella whispered. "We have to stop him." But before they reached the landing, a sharp crash echoed through the upper hall, the sound of furniture overturned, followed by Lena's scream. When they burst into the room, the scene that greeted them was chaos. The candle had fallen. The curtains smoldered. Lena was on the floor, struggling to rise, and Craig stood over her, his face streaked with tears and fury. "Craig," Estella shouted. "Stop this." He turned toward her, the pistol now in his hand. "I can't," he said. "It's the only way." "Put it down, my son," she pleaded. "Please." But his eyes had gone far beyond reason. "She killed our child," he said, his voice trembling. "And I made her my sister." He turned back to Lena, his expression collapsing into anguish. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Lena, still kneeling, looked up at him through tears. "Then end it. Please, end it for both of us." For a moment, he froze, torn between horror and mercy. The thunder outside cracked so violently, the walls shuddered. Then his hand moved. A single gunshot. The echo rolled through the halls and into the fields, where it startled the horses in their stalls. Estella screamed. Eliza pushed past her into the room. Lena lay against the hearthstone, her head at an impossible angle, her blood seeping into the cracks of the floor. Craig dropped the pistol, his eyes wide with disbelief, as though he couldn't understand how his hands had acted faster than his thoughts. He fell to his knees beside her. "Lena," he said softly, shaking her shoulder. "Lena, please wake up." She didn't. Esteja entered slowly, her breath shallow. "Craig," she said, her voice trembling. "What have you done?" He looked up at her, tears streaming down his face. "I set her free." Before she could speak, Craig picked up the pistol again. His hand steadied now, his face strangely calm. "Craig, no." He turned the barrel toward himself. "I'm going to her," he said, and pulled the trigger. The second shot was quieter, muffled by the storm. Estella screamed again, but her voice was drowned by thunder. Eliza rushed to her, catching her before she collapsed. "Don't look, Miss Estella, don't you look." But Estella did look at the two bodies on the floor, entwined even in death. Outside, rain began to fall, hard and cold. It washed against the windows, streaking the glass like tears. The fire in the curtains sputtered out, leaving only smoke. By morning, word had spread through the quarters that the master and the house girl were dead. The slaves gathered silently outside the big house, none daring to enter. They watched as the sheriff's carriage arrived, its wheels sinking into the mud. Sheriff William Hartwell was a friend of the family. He had known Donovan, hunted with him, drunk his brandy. When he saw the scene inside, he didn't ask questions. "A tragedy," he said finally. "Murder, then suicide, temporary madness." He folded his notebook and looked at Estella. "I'll see to it the papers say no more than that." Estella nodded, her face blank. She didn't thank him. There were no words left. Craig was buried in the Lambert family cemetery, his coffin polished and proper. Lena was laid to rest in the slave graveyard. Beside the tiny mound of her child, the two graves faced each other across the same stretch of red clay, divided by an old fence, one for those who owned, one for those who were owned. At the funeral, Estella stood alone between them, her black veil trembling in the wind. She whispered something no one could hear, and when she turned away, her face was white as the sky before a storm. Behind her, Mammy Eliza bowed her head and murmured, "Let the dead rest, Lord, even if the living never will." The wind carried her words across the fields, over the willow tree, and into the silence that would haunt the Lambert land for generations. By dawn the next day, the Lambert plantation had become a house of whispers. The servants moved in slow, frightened silence. No one dared speak above a murmur, as if the walls themselves might still be listening for the voices that had screamed the night before. The sheriff's men arrived before sunrise. Sheriff William Hartwell was a man who understood the South's unspoken rule that certain truths were never to be written down. He walked through the main house, hat in hand, his boots leaving prints in the dried blood. The scene was plain enough to any eye, a young master driven mad by grief, his lover dead by his hand. But Hartwell saw more than he let on. He glanced once at Estella, standing motionless at the foot of the stairs, and knew she would not survive this long. When he spoke, his voice was soft, rehearsed. "We'll call it what it needs to be. Mrs. Lambert, a temporary derangement, a tragedy of the heart. The county won't ask questions." Estella's lips parted, but no sound came. She nodded once, the gesture slow, mechanical. By evening, the bodies were gone. Craig was placed in the Lambert family plot, buried beside the father he had despised. Lena's coffin, smaller, rougher, built from pine, was carried by the field hands to the slave cemetery, where the first child already slept beneath the willow. No headstone, no name, only the earth to remember her. At the graveside, Estella stood between them, her son's grave on one side, Lena's on the other, and felt the weight of a life spent keeping secrets. She didn't weep. Her eyes were dry and empty, as though tears had been wrung out of her long ago. When the preacher finished the prayers, she whispered something no one could hear, then turned and walked back toward the house. After the funerals, Sheriff Hartwell visited her once more. He asked for the official account he would give to the papers. Estella handed him a brief note written in her own hand. On the night of November 27, Itembaba Sushalio, my son, Craig Lambert, suffered a moment of insanity brought on by grief. In a fit of despair, he took the life of a house servant and then his own. The matter ends here. Hartwell folded the note without reading further. That will do. He closed the file and never opened it again. The next morning, all traces of the tragedy were erased. The servants scrubbed the floorboards clean. The carpets were replaced. The furniture rearranged. The blood disappeared. But the house still smelled of gunpowder and sorrow. Estella dismissed the overseer and released half the field hands to neighboring estates. The harvest is no longer our concern, she said. No one argued. Days passed, then weeks. She no longer attended church. The neighbors whispered that she had taken ill. In truth, she simply stopped living. She ate little of, slept less, and spent most of her days in the upstairs parlor, staring through the window toward the two cemeteries divided by the old fence. Some nights, Eliza found her standing at that same window long after midnight, her lips moving in silent conversation with someone who wasn't there. Come to bed, Miss Estella, Eliza would plead softly. The night's cold. But Estella never seemed to hear. By spring of 1847, her body began to fail. Her face grew gaunt. Her eyes dimmed. Her voice barely a whisper. She told Eliza she no longer wanted the doctor summoned. No physician can cure a soul, she said. Let me go to them. On a warm April night, she did. Eliza found her the next morning in her bed, her hands folded, her eyes closed, her lips curved faintly as though she had seen something merciful at last. The Lambert line ended there. After her death, the estate was sold quietly to a family of Savannah merchants named Morrison. The sheriff handled the transaction personally, ensuring that no gossip followed the property. The Morrison family arrived that summer, a husband, a wife, and two small daughters. They admired the grand white columns and the broad fields, calling it the most promising land in Edgefield. But the promise did not last. From their first week, strange things unsettled the new owners. At night they heard footsteps on the upper floors when no one was there. Doors opened on their own. One of the daughters awoke, screaming, claiming she'd seen a woman standing by her bed, with eyes like silver and a red dress that dripped. The workers refused to stay past sundown. They said the house breathed wrong. Some swore they saw light moving through the empty nursery or heard a lullaby sung in a woman's voice long after midnight. Mr. Morrison, a practical man, dismissed it all as superstition until the morning he found muddy footprints across the parlor, small and bare, leading from the front door to the cold hearth where the blood had once dried. There were no prints leading out. Within 2 years, the Morrisons abandoned the property. They told neighbors they were leaving because of financial losses, but in private letters later found by their relatives, Mrs. Morrison wrote, "The air in that house feels thick with something unholy. At night we hear crying that seems to come from beneath the floors. My husband will not speak of it, but I know the place is cursed. The land will not keep peace." They sold the estate at half its value. The next family lasted only 1 season. Then another came and went. Each departure left the house more hollow, the garden more overgrown, the fields more fallow. By the 1852, the Lambert plantation was already a ruin wrapped in legend. People called it the widow's house, others simply the cursed field. Travelers avoided the road that passed it after dark. Some swore they could hear a baby crying near the willow when the wind blew from the east. Others claimed they'd seen a man kneeling by an invisible grave, whispering to the earth. Mammy Eliza lived to hear all the stories. She stayed on through each new owner, too old to move, too burdened by guilt to leave. The Mauritians let her remain in a small cabin near the quarters. They called her the Old One and avoided her after sundown. She spent her last years blind and frail, her voice little more than a rasp. But each evening, as dusk settled over the fields, she would light a single candle and pray not for herself, but for the souls she could not save. When she died in 1852, they found her still kneeling beside her bed, her hands clasped, the candle burned down to its base. She was buried near the slave cemetery, close enough to hear the wind in the willow. For years afterward, people claimed to see a faint light flickering near that spot at night, moving slowly between the two graveyards. Some said it was Eliza's spirit, still keeping watch. Others said it was something darker, the unrest of a family that had built its fortune on sin and died by its own blood. Whatever it was, no one stayed long enough to find out. By 1889, more than 40 years after the tragedy, lightning struck the house during a summer storm, setting the upper floors ablaze. The fire consumed everything. Only the stone foundations and a few charred columns remained. Locals said the flames began in the very room where Craig and Lena had died. They burned with such intensity that even the rain couldn't quench them until dawn. When the fire finally died, the air smelled not of smoke, but of iron, as if the land itself had exhaled after decades of holding its breath. By the time the century turned, the Lambert plantation had become little more than a scar on the South Carolina landscape. The grand Georgian house was gone, reduced to foundations choked by ivy and roots that pushed through its broken tiles. The once perfect columns lay toppled among briars, and the air smelled of damp earth and iron. Only the wind still remembered how to move through those corridors, carrying whispers no human throat could shape anymore. Farmers avoided the place. They said the soil there wouldn't take seed, that corn planted on the old Lambert fields came up pale and stunted, as if the ground refused to nurture life again. Hunters passing near the ruins reported hearing soft weeping near the willow, though no woman could be found. Travelers spoke of lanterns glowing faintly at the edge of the wood, always at dusk, always near the line that once separated the family cemetery from the slaves. Those who braved the ruins swore the temperature dropped suddenly when they approached the spot where the main staircase once stood. Sometimes, they said, you could hear a creak like someone stepping onto a stair that was no longer there, and a faint voice murmuring a prayer, ending always with the words, "Forgive us, Father." Locals built stories from fragments of truth. Some said the curse began when Craig Lambert killed his own blood. Others whispered that Donovan's sins had called something into the world that could never be sent away. A few believed Estella's ghost still walked the grounds, endlessly searching for her son, her lantern flickering between the two graveyards. But the oldest residents, the ones whose grandparents had worked the fields, said something quieter, that the real haunting was not in the ruins, but in the silence people kept about them. History, after all, prefers tidy endings. The official record said nothing more than a domestic tragedy. Eaten by Sishalu. The ledgers did not mention Lena, or her child, or the woman who risked her soul to tell the truth. Her grave, like countless others, melted back into the red clay, yet truth has a way of surviving. In 1889, after the fire, a county surveyor sketched the remains of the property. In his notes, he described finding odd depressions near the slave cemetery and an oak casket buried apart from the others, its lid sealed with iron nails, unusual for the time. He wrote that when the coffin was lifted, a gust of wind howled through the broken windows, as if the house were breathing again. He left the site before sunset and never returned. By the 1920 the land had been sold for timber. Workers cutting through the underbrush unearthed fragments of brick and bone. They said the bones were small, child-sized, and that when they touched them the air went still. The foreman ordered everything reburied and told the men to keep quiet. The lumber company records show the tract was abandoned within the year. Today, the Lambert plantation exists only in rumor and archive. The foundations lie hidden under moss and pine needles. The willow still stands, blackened but alive. If you visit in winter, when the leaves are gone and the wind comes from the east, you might hear the faint echo of a cradle rocking or the creak of a door that no longer exists. Local children dare each other to visit after dark. They say if you kneel by the old fence dividing the two cemeteries and whisper Lena, you'll hear another voice answer from the other side, whispering Craig. No one stays long enough to see if it's true. But beyond the ghost stories lies something harder, something truer. The tragedy of the Lambert family is not about spirits bound to the earth. It's about the living who built their fortunes on suffering and then tried to hide it. Donovan Lambert's empire of cotton was grown from blood. His son's desperate attempt at love was only a reflection of that corruption turned inward. Every generation inherits the ghosts it refuses to name. Estella believed that revealing the truth would cleanse her house. Instead, it consumed it. Her story forces a question that echoes far beyond those ruins. Are some truths too heavy to bear, or is the silence that hides them the greater sin? Maybe that is why, even now, the land will not rest. Each time the wind moves through the trees, it carries a sound like breath drawn through a prayer, gentle, sorrowful, unending. Some say it is the voice of Mammy Eliza, still watching over the graves she could never reconcile. Others believe it is the land itself remembering. If you ever find yourself near Edgefield, stand among the ruins at dusk. Listen closely. You might hear a woman's lullaby fade into the wind, or a man's whisper lost in the rustle of leaves. Or maybe you'll hear nothing at all, only the hush that follows when a story ends but refuses to die. Because the Lambert plantation is gone. But the questions it left behind are not. They live in every hidden ledger, every unmarked grave, every silence that history calls respectable. And perhaps that's what haunts us most, not the ghosts we see, but the ones we choose not to.